Good morning. My name is Bob Meek, or actually Robert Henry Meek Jr. I was named for my dad, who served in World War II and was killed in action. When I give my talks about my dad, I often entitle it as One Man's Legacy. As a war orphan of World War II, I'm amongst the 183,000 of us that the Veterans Administration estimates lost their dads in World War II. But I am not the first war orphan in my family. As a matter of fact, I lost a great-great-grandfather on my mother's side and my father's side in the American Civil War. I have a picture of one of them, which I'm showing you here. This is my great-grandfather, John Frederick Meek. His dad was captured and died in a federal prison camp in Alton, Illinois, when he was 2 years old. I also had one on my mother's side. Her father's great-grandfather was captured at the Battle of Fort Fisher in North Carolina and died in a federal prison camp in Elmira, New York. So I come from a legacy, if you will, of World War II, of orphans. My father was born in southern Ohio, the family just having moved across from Kentucky, which is where most of his relatives were from. He loved the outdoors. They moved to Cleveland, Ohio, as he was starting high school for my grandfather's work. He graduated from South High in January of 1941. Got a football scholarship, actually, to Penn State. Went one semester, which was the fall of 41. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, he dropped out of college and enlisted in the Army Air Corps, went through aviation cadet training, and became a pilot. He was sent to Columbia, South Carolina, to the air base there to be trained in transition to B-25 bombers. As young pilots still do, they were out cruising one afternoon, Saturday afternoon for girls to meet, and my mother was a student at Columbia College, which was an all-girls school. He happened to run into her and ask her to go to the church the next day. So they did. They had a whirlwind courtship. I'm going to show you real quickly. This is a picture of my mother on their honeymoon. And then this is my father's formal portrait in his uniform. They were married on June 4th, obviously not knowing about D-Day 2 days away. This is a picture of their wedding. They were married in the chapel at Columbia Army Air Base. And my all-time favorite picture of both of them is this picture where they were on their honeymoon down near Charleston, South Carolina. As I said, they were married on June 4th. August the 28th, he left for overseas. As was the practice then, usually a crew would be put together. They would pick up an airplane and fly it to the war zone, wherever they were going. They generally, on the East Coast, flew south to Brazil. And once they left the continental United States, they opened their orders and it told them where they were going. They would land in Brazil, refuel, and then either head to the Pacific or over to Europe. My dad and his crew really thought they were going to the Pacific, but when they opened the orders, it sent them to North Africa, his unit being there, having just been there. They landed in North Africa. At the base there, the unit had then been moved up to near Italy. So they then proceeded to Corsica, which at that time was a French island just off the coast of Italy. And there he began his combat unit. Each new pilot flew with a trained crew for approximately 15 missions in order to get combat experience, and then got their own crew. This is a picture of the crew that my dad trained with the most. That is my dad on the right. The gentleman standing in the middle with the life vest on was Bill Cochran. He ended up retiring from the Air Force as a major general. The day that my dad was killed in action, that crew had earned enough time in combat for an R&R, so they were gone, and he was filling in on another crew as a co-pilot. He was in the 480th Bomb Squadron, which was a part of the 340th Bomb Group, which is a part of the 57th Bomb Wing. They were medium bombers because in Italy, the northern supply routes were heavily guarded by anti-aircraft guns, and the heavy bombers flew at the ideal altitude for those anti-aircraft guns to take them on. So they used medium bombers because they could go in much lower. Even though it was the practice to send in 3 planes in the lead called the shaft element that dropped white phosphorus bombs and aluminum shaft to confuse the radar control guns, and also to try to keep the gunners off the anti-aircraft guns while the rest of the group attacked a bridge. It was the Magenta Bridge, which is on the Magenta River about 20 miles northwest of Milan. They began their attack just a little before noon on the 19th. My father's plane was the left wing of the shaft element. An anti-aircraft shell exploded just above and to the right of the canopy, and a piece of flak struck him in the forehead and killed him instantly. I met the bombardier who was leading the element some years later here in North Carolina. He carried survivor's guilt for all those years because he had made the correct course correction that took him into took the planes into the flak, and he actually had seen my father hit. I was told that it was my father's practice to put a picture of my mother up on the dashboard somewhere in the plane. So quite possibly she was the last thing he ever saw. I am grateful, even though I lost him, I am grateful that he did not suffer. This is a picture of the plane. You can see in the top in this picture how shot up it was. And the pilot, Mr. Lentz, the bombardier, and one of the gunners were all wounded. Mr. Lentz was able to get, Lieutenant Lentz was able to get he said he had blood all in his eyes. He was able to get it out. He reached over, and my dad was slumped against the bulkhead, and he realized he was dead. He was able to get the plane back to Corsica, though, and land it and save the other crew members that were wounded. They wore flak vests and flak helmets, but you can see from this picture, they didn't necessarily do much good. This is the nose art that was on that particular plane, which was tail number 7 Zulu. It was named, Shirley Ann was the crew chief's girlfriend, and of course they used different nose art. A lot of the planes in my dad's squadron had Willie and Joe, the cartoon characters, or characters drawn by Ernie Pyle, and he actually came to visit the squadron one time because they had that many on it. In addition, the 487th was sister to the 488th Bomb Squadron. They were right next to each other on Corsica, and the 488th's fame came from the fact that Heller, who wrote Catch 22, was in that squadron. Now, most of his story in Catch 22 took place when the unit was in North Africa before they moved up into Corsica. As the custom was at the time, the telegram actually came to my grandparents in Lower South Carolina. They called up to Columbia, where my mother and her sister were both attending. My mother said she knew that he was probably dead because they asked to talk to my aunt, her sister, and not to her. She said if he'd been wounded, they would have talked to her. So my grandparents and the veteran service officer drove up to Columbia, which is about a 90-mile trip, to deliver the news. This is the actual telegram. This was how they were notified in World War II of MIAs and KIAs and wounded in action. They didn't, that was the telegram you did not want. And that was how the news, contrary to like my generation in Vietnam and subsequent, someone physically went out to the family to notify them. And that day you just got a telegram. My mother then immediately telegrammed my paternal grandparents, my father's mother and father, and let them know. I actually have the letter that my grandfather wrote back to my mother. To this day, I have difficulty reading it all the way through because of the emotions that my grandfather and grandmother expressed in it about losing their younger son. My Uncle Bill, who was my dad's older brother, was serving in the Navy at the time. At the end of the war, the unit was returned back to the States. Colonel Willis, who was the group commander when my dad was there, actually got sent to Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah, Georgia, which was very close to where my mother lived. My mother actually finished school. We lived with her parents and her 4 siblings on the farm in Lower South Carolina. So I grew up with aunts, I spent my first 5 years on the farm with my grandparents and my aunts and uncles and my mother, who completed a college degree and got her master's degree and began teaching. When I was 6 months old, we went to Hunter Army Airfield, and you can see Colonel Willis here pinning my dad's air medal on me at 6 months old. My mother was actually 4.5 months pregnant with me when my dad was killed. And so I was subsequently born in March of 1945. So while my dad knew he was going to be a father, he never knew he had a son, and I never knew my dad. Some of the members of the American World War II Orphans Network, which I'm currently serving as treasurer of, have memories of their dad and knew their father, but I never knew mine. After the war, of course, during the war, those that were killed were buried in temporary cemeteries, which were generally somewhere around in the area. At the end of the war, the overseas cemeteries were established because General Pershing in World War I had started those, and they were administered by the American Battlefield Monuments Commission, which is an executive branch commission that still runs the 33 overseas cemeteries. The most famous one, of course, is the one we see at Normandy, generally when we have an anniversary of D-Day. And everybody knows that, but there are actually 33 of them. There are 2 in Italy. One is in Florence, and one is in the little town called Vettuno, which is near Anzio, where the amphibious landing was made just south of Rome. My dad's unit flew support missions and a lot of those ground combat things, as well as supply line interdiction. Because of the Alps, there were just 1 or 2 very limited supply routes for the Germans into Italy. So they were heavily guarded, and primarily by anti-aircraft rather than by fighters. A little aside, I was up in D.C. for the week-long program that Friends of the World War II Memorial do for teachers for their teaching, and it was one of the presenters there. I met Colonel, now Brigadier General McGee, who was a Tuskegee Airman. After his presentation, got to chatting with him, and come to find out that his unit had actually flown fighter cover for my dad's bomber unit, both of them serving in that area at the same time. So it's not inconceivable that Colonel McGee actually flew a fighter protecting my dad's bomber squadron. After the war, the families were given the choice of either bringing the deceased back to the United States or leaving them in these cemeteries. The cemeteries are deeded in perpetuity by the countries to the United States and are American sacred soil. The one my dad is buried in is called Sicily, Rome. This is a picture of the entrance to the gate, and this is a picture of me kneeling beside my dad's marker when I visited in 1985. This is a brochure about the cemetery that was published at the time, and a picture of my dad's grave with flowers. I have flowers put on his grave 4 times a year in commemoration. This is another picture of the flowers that can be had. And of course, they decorate the graves on Memorial and Veterans Day and with flags in the anniversary of their death. There are about 9,000 buried in my dad's cemetery and another 5,000 commemorated in the chapel who were missing in action in the Mediterranean theater. All told, there's about 100,000 buried overseas in these overseas cemeteries, and another about 50,000 missing in action commemorated in the chapels. Some of the more famous one is General Patton is buried at Ham in Luxembourg. I've been to his that cemetery and seen his grave. Glenn Miller is commemorated in the Cambridge, England cemetery because his plane went missing in action over the Channel. And I've been also to Normandy and, of course, Sicily, Rome. So they're beautifully kept. They're reverence places. And I can't think of a better place for him to rest. All my sons, my 3 sons, have visited their grandfather's grave. And I hope in the near future to be able to take my wife. She's never had the opportunity. Part of his legacy is, as I said, I am his only child and survivor. He is survived by 3 sons who are all married and 2 have children. So he has 4 great-grandchildren. I was interested all my life in things military. I'm not sure why, but I did ROTC during the Vietnam War, was commissioned as 2nd lieutenant, served for 5 years of active duty, and then came off active duty and served about 25 years in the Guard and Reserve, retiring as a colonel in 1999. My middle son, who is named for me and his grandfather, Robert III, and David, my youngest, are both in the military. Rob is a Army JAG officer, which is a lawyer, and he serves with the Armed Forces Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. And David, my youngest, is an Air Force major, and he serves as an intelligence officer with Air Force Services. I have a picture here of the 3 of us at my youngest, at David's commissioning from the University of Georgia. All of us were commissioned with my dad's 2nd lieutenant bars. I was commissioned in 67, Rob was commissioned in 05, and David was commissioned in 2010. If you'll notice the cap device on the Army hats, that has not changed since World War II. So now my son, Rob, wears his grandfather's cap device on his cap, and my son, David, even though he's not a pilot, has his grandfather's pilot's wings. Vanek Volkan, who is a world-famous psychiatrist, and does grief, is married to a member, Betty Volkan of A1, and he calls these commemorative things we have as linking objects. In 1992, I took my mother to Colombia for the 50th anniversary of the formation of the squadron. I met a lot of the people that served with my dad, the men who took his body off the plane, the doctor that certified him deceased, and Colonel Willis, who was still alive at the time, who had been the last group commander. I do have a picture of the three of us that duplicates that one as me as a 6-month-old baby. And I also met members of the crew that he flew overseas with. He was apparently quite a jokester, but he'd had a little appendicitis problem and was in the hospital. So he got several of the members, the guys that were in there with him, provided refreshments for him and got them to agree. And as soon as they were all discharged from the hospital, they put together a crew and then went and asked to get a plane to go overseas. As I mentioned earlier, they took off on the East Coast and flew to Brazil. Once they got out over the ocean, they opened their orders. And as I said, they were surprised they were going to be sent to Europe rather than the Pacific. Each squadron had about 16 planes. There were 4 squadrons in a group, and then a number of different groups in a wing. The wing was commanded by usually a brigadier or major general, and each group was commanded by a full colonel, and each squadron by a major. As many of you know from watching World War II movies, promotions became very quick in the Army Air Corps because of the attrition rate. It was a very high loss of people. I was very, very blessed. My mother was able to keep me close to my paternal grandparents. When I was 5, she met another veteran of World War II and married. And I have one half-sister who was his child. This is a picture of my adopted dad and me about the time they got married. I call him Daddy. I tell people I was twice blessed. I had a dad who gave me life and a dad who taught me how to live it. He adopted me but did not change my name. That greatly endeared him to my paternal grandparents, and he got along with them extremely well. My wife one time asked him about that, and he said, well, I'm a veteran. If I'd had an only son and not survived, I wouldn't want anybody changing his name. He was in the Navy. His ship was one of the first ships to go into Nagasaki, where they had dropped the atomic bomb. And he died at the age of 62 in 1985 of colon cancer. The VA later ruled that anyone that had been in Nagasaki, Hiroshima, or who participated in the atomic test after the war and developed one of 33 cancers was service-related. So ultimately, my mother ended up losing 2 husbands, and I losing 2 dads to World War II, just about 40 years apart. My daddy died 3 weeks before the 40th anniversary of my dad's death. But as I said, he got along very well with my paternal grandparents, and they enjoyed each other's company. But I was blessed to have him as an adopted dad and honor his service also as well. I did not know any other, or knowingly know any other World War II orphans until I was about 55 years old. My mother had just read Tom Brokaws' book, The Greatest Generation, and he mentioned AWON, which is the American World War II Orphans Network. Ann Mix, our founder, had been to a No Greater Love event in D.C. and realized that she didn't know any either, her dad having been lost in World War II in the 10th Mountain Division. So she decided to try to start this organization. One of the things she did was she asked Bob Dole, whom we recently lost, to be an advisor to the unit because he was in the same unit as her dad, and he readily agreed. Now, I had the honor of working for Senator Elizabeth Dole when she was in the Senate. I was on her Senate staff, and it was quite a pleasure to get to know the Doles. Senator Dole, Bob Dole, had a very wicked, dry sense of humor, and he told some great stories. But he was truly a remarkable serviceman and also senator, and served. And Senator Dole, Elizabeth Dole, now has a foundation that supports caregivers to our wounded service people now. The service is available to wounded and also survivors of our military people now are infinitely greater than they were to my mother and to myself. As one of our members of A1 said, we got that $55 check once a month, whether we wanted it or not. As many of you who have been to the World War II Memorial know, the Wall of Stars is to commemorate the slightly more than 400,000 U.S. men and women who died in action in World War II. And Meek was instrumental in getting the architect to change to that. As we say in A1, that's the one gold star you do not want. It was a custom started in World War I to hang a blue star in the window for anyone in service. And if they were killed in action or missing in action, then you sewed a gold star over it to indicate that. That custom was then revived in World War II, and as a matter of fact, is carried on today for those that we lose in our current military actions. As I said, my two younger sons have both served. They were both deployed to Afghanistan at the same time, and honor their grandfather's legacy by serving in the military. The last thing I'd like to mention is when 2001, 9/11 occurred, a local reporter here in Charlotte, North Carolina, somehow knew about myself and several other people of the area that were World War II orphans, and he contacted us and interviewed us. I have the article here that appeared in the Charlotte Observer and talked about what feelings, advice we could give to the orphans that were created on that day, and now subsequently in the 21 years since that event occurred. I am grateful that we have the services now that are available. There are a number of organizations that support grief camps and things like that, and counseling and big buddy programs and whatever for those members of the family who lost a loved one. And there are a number of organizations, worthy organizations, that support our veterans that are wounded. For my generation that fought in Vietnam, we didn't have that. As a matter of fact, we were not looked upon very kindly by the American public when we came home. That's my story. That's my legacy. My father was not quite 23 years old when he died. I've now lived 3 times as long as he did. As I said, I have 3 sons that carry his surname, and 2 of them have children, and so I have 2 grandsons and 2 granddaughters, which would be his great grandchildren, and they have all been very successful and good people. So I think for his short life, he had quite a legacy. It is the price we pay for freedom. As I said, I lost my dad in World War II. I lost my friends in Vietnam. I lost my troops in the first Gulf War, and now my son's friends and troops. and Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Afghanistan Freedom. But I am grateful. Had the circumstances not worked out like they were, I would not be here. My sons would not be here, and my grandchildren would not be here. So everything has a purpose. There is a plan, I believe, and ultimately, I believe that someday I will actually get to see my biological father face to face. Thank you, and I will be happy to take your questions now.